Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. Continuing with our last session of what a cluster is, and we went over what a cluster is. Now we're actually going to create a cluster. And remember, a cluster is a group of servers which work together in a single system to provide HA solutions for all the services. So before we can actually set up always on, as I mentioned, we need to create a cluster. So let's do that now. So go back to our server 1, and on the server 1, just click your window key, and you'll see this Failover Cluster Manager. Double click or single click it, and this window pops up. As you can see, this is where you can manage the actual cluster and actually create a cluster. But before we even create a cluster, what we need to do is what's called validate our configuration. So this validate configuration is a process where it takes the various nodes that you're going to give for the cluster, and it verifies everything that it's ready for the clustering. And if there are any issues, we have to solve them first. So even before we create a cluster, it's better to do a validation of configuration. The way you can do that is right-click here and go Valid Configuration. And this window pops up. And you can read it quickly. It says, before you begin, the wizard runs validations tests to determine whether this configuration of servers that we're going to give or attached storage, we don't have to worry about that since always on doesn't depend on that, is set up correctly for the failover. So basically this process is going to say, hey, you're giving me a set of nodes and replicas. Are they ready for failover? And if they are, great. So go next. Here is where we add the appropriate server. So select servers or a cluster. To validate a set of servers, add the names here. So I've already clicked it here. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that we started with assigning IP addresses with the domain controller beginning with 50. Then server 1 was 51, server 2 is 52, server 3 is 53. And now this one is going to require, the cluster itself is going to require an IP address. And the next consecutive one that's open is 54. So that's what we're going to do. Now remember, yours will vary depending on your internet provider. But again, we've gone through this process again. I'm going to call mine. So it's asking for, enter the name. I can do the IP address or the server name. I'm just going to go and copy, paste these and enter and go add. So this is the one I want as a selected server to act as one of my nodes. So I want to do that the same thing for 2. And I'm going to add that. And obviously I'm going to do the same thing for 3. So I have 3 nodes for this cluster. And go next. Oops. Did I add it? Make sure you add it. And therefore go next. Now, choose between the running all tests or running selected tests. And it says run all tests. And I would highly recommend you do this rather than choosing this. And the reason is it's going to go through a thorough test of making sure your network is configured, your hard drives are configured, your configuration of everything is configured properly, servers, network, storage, and it's going to pass all the tests. And obviously, if it's not, then you're going to have to fix them. So I would highly recommend you do that. Now, this may take about anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. So again, while this is going on, I will pause the video and come back. But I'm going to begin so you can see what's going on. So go next. And there it is. So it's going to go through this. It's just telling you which servers to test. We've given them 3 nodes and go next. And there it is. So starting now. So it's going to go through this process of going through. There's a tremendous amount of tests that it goes through. And we need obviously 100% green lights on all of them. Some will have warnings that we can bypass, but if there are any red ones, then those have to be addressed or the server or the cluster will not work. It's important to do this. This is critical, and I can't emphasize how important doing this is before we even set up the cluster. So I'll let this continue when this finishes, and if there are any, I know there'll be some warning signs that we can look over, and then we'll go over a few of them, and then we'll continue with creating a cluster, which is a set of nodes. So I'm just going to pause this video here, and then I'll come back when this is finished. So I'll see you in a second. And we're back. And as you can see, the Failover Cluster Validation Report has been completed. So if I scroll down through this, obviously we're looking for green check marks and success descriptions. But as you'll notice, as I go scroll down, I am going to get some warning signs about network communication and so on. So obviously you can click on these and look at the view the report itself from here. And do that later. And then obviously you can review the report. Now I'm not going to go through this process because when we talk about the actual clustering, I'm going to go into this in a little more detail. But the key thing to understand is that we didn't get any red marks here, which is critical because those have to be done. So, and if you go scroll down here, the overall result, you'll see it says testing is completed successfully, and it appears that it's suitable for clustering. So we can do this. So now it says create cluster, and I'm going to go finish. And now it's going to go next. And now it's going to ask for a cluster name. So I'm going to call it RA Academy. And now obviously it's asking for an IP address. So remember the IP address that we're going to assign this is 54. So it's going to be right here, 54. And that's the next sequential one, I believe. So let's say 54. Go next. And obviously it's going to validate now the IP address that we can utilize it. If it can't, then we'll change it. So obviously here you're ready to create a cluster, and it's got a cluster's name is RA Academy. The various nodes are the 1, 2, and 3, and the IP address is .54. And all are eligible for storage cluster, and that's fine. So go next. And now this is going to take a few minutes also to create it, and then we'll have a cluster. So what we'll have, a cluster is a set of servers that work in harmony together, and that's the whole point of always on. Now this whole process needs to be enabled and set up before we can do always on. In clustering, which is a slightly more advanced technology, it requires the combination of external storage systems, and that's what we'll be discussing here. So it seems like we're good. You can view the report, but let's go finish. And it'll just take a second. And here, obviously, you'll see now it's going to obviously validate the configuration. And now we have a cluster called RA Academy. And if I expand this and expand the nodes and storage and these various things, you can see the networks. Again, I'm not going to go through this process in detail because all this cluster process we're going to be talking about when we actually talk about cluster, and I'll be talking about this interface and specific things that we can go. But if I go to cluster network 1, you can see the various networks. If I expand it, and again, don't worry about this at this point. All this is doing is creating a cluster of the various nodes, and that's it. So at this point, I'm just going to minimize this, and we don't need to deal with it at all. So we've created a cluster. Now, if I go to server 2, and if I click the window key and go here, click on the failover manager, and if I go 3, click on the key and go failover cluster manager, you'll see that I can access them from each one if you want to. So that's fine. So just FYI there that we can access those from either one. And obviously this one's giving it a snapping. And that's fine. So now that we've created that, let's go to server 1. And remember, now we need to actually join it. We still can't, if we right click always on, is not available group. We need to join it. Remember the server manager here? Click on that yes. And now go to server 1. And we're going to have to do this for all 3 nodes. So go to the server SQL server, in this case MSQL, go to properties. Go to high availability. And now you can see that now that we've created a cluster called RA Academy, we can enable always on group. And we go OK, and obviously the services are going to have to restart. We can go OK. So we have to do this for the entire process again. So click here, go yes. And I'm going to do this relatively straightforward. Right click, properties, always on. And again, we're going to enable this now that we have a cluster. And this is going to restart also. So, and lastly on 3. Yes. And in the next video now, what we're going to do is actually start the process of always on. We're going to set up the databases that are going to migrate to the replica databases, and then we're going to look at a few configurations here. So let's go over here. And I think the services have started. And let's go over 2. That's done. And let's go over 3. And that's done. So now let's go to server 1. And remember, I couldn't do anything here when I right-clicked it. So let's look at it, refresh it. Oh, maybe we need to refresh it. Or we need to look at the thing, see if it took it out. Maybe we need to refresh the... We close that. We do need to make sure that it's restarting. So let's restart services on all 3, just to be on the safe side. Restart, and then on 3, restart. And then I believe we have enabled them also. So let's just double check. Okay, it's not asking to restart, so that's good. That's checked, so that's good also. I think that's probably what the reason why maybe we didn't restart it, even though I thought it restarted automatically. Oops, restarting, that's fine. So let's look at our SQL servers here now and refresh it. And there we go. So that's we're good. And let's close this. I think we're good there also. Make sure we restart that, which it is. It's not starting on that one. Well, let's look at this one here. One more double check to make sure everything's okay. It doesn't seem to be taking the properties that are set. So actually I'm just going to kill this and restart this. And we can go back to 1. Let me restart this. Go back to 1 since that is applicated. Now, as you can see, I have the option of availability groups. And if I right click, we can start with new availability groups. And we're going to go over through a great dashboard that you can view all the HA solutions and the availability groups that are associated with each server. So I'm going to actually continue that with the next video while this is up. So now that we've had several steps in preparing the servers for joining a cluster, we've looked at the services that we need to do to install at the start. We looked at, actually, let me just go over here so we can kind of go through sequentially. So it makes it a little easier. So we've done this. We've installed the failover cluster services on each node and restarted the computer or the services. We added a shared folder for all the backups. We made a backup of the primary server and the secondary servers. We made sure that all are in full recovery mode that are involved. Then we set up a cluster as we just did, and then we validated the cluster that the cluster indeed complies with all the rules and regulations of a cluster. And then we restarted the various computers. And what we're going to do now is actually set up the HA solution always on, and we'll continue that with the next video. So I'll just leave it here and we'll begin in the next session. So my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.